Edward Hawthorne had always been a man of intellect, structure, and quiet pride. A retired literature professor with 3 decades of academic honors behind him, he had long commanded respect not only within the university halls, but also within the Hawthorne family, though that had started to change. After his wife, Margaret, passed away 5 years ago, the once vibrant family dinners faded into sparse visits, and his meticulously kept home began to feel hollow. His 2 adult children, Susan and Daniel, checked in occasionally, but the warmth was gone. They had their own families, their own lives, their own ambitions. Edward had long accepted that his golden years would be more about solitude than celebration. But as his 70s crept forward, something in him grew restless. It wasn't loneliness, it was curiosity. A deep, unsettling question lingered. Who would truly care when there was nothing left to gain? The idea came not from malice, but from observation. It started subtly. A few years after Margaret's passing, Edward began noticing how his children spoke about him when they thought he wasn't listening. "We'll need to sort the will," Susan whispered to her husband after one of his minor hospital visits. "He's clearly slipping." Daniel once remarked during a rushed birthday call, "He won't even know what we got him. Don't stress it." What struck Edward wasn't the lack of time they gave him, but the transactional tone of their interactions. The clock was ticking. They were waiting. The first time he deliberately pretended to forget where he put his reading glasses, he watched closely. Susan's reaction was sharp and impatient. "Dad, you left them in the fridge again. This is getting worse." She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't sit down with him. She left the room in frustration. That night, Edward retrieved his glasses from their actual location, in a study drawer where he always kept them, and sat alone in the quiet. The seed had been planted. Over the course of the next few months, he crafted the role with the precision of a scholar, forgetting names, repeating questions, leaving the television on with static blaring. He didn't overdo it, not yet. He read clinical reports, watched interviews with real dementia patients, and learned the subtle, believable signs of early-stage cognitive decline. He didn't want attention. He wanted truth. Susan was the first to act. "It's not safe for you to be alone anymore," she said during a family brunch. Her tone was coated with concern, but underneath was something rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for the chance. "You should come live with us. We've got the guest house. It's private. You'll have your own space." Edward nodded, thanked her, and agreed. Privately, he saw it for what it was, convenient containment. She didn't want daily interaction. She wanted control. The guest house was pleasant but sterile. Susan furnished it with pre-owned furniture and a new TV, but didn't bother asking him what he liked. A nurse came by 3 times a week, mostly to make sure he hadn't wandered off. She was kind enough, but clinical. Daniel sent a few text messages. "Hang in there, Dad," one said. "We'll figure this out." He lived just 40 minutes away, but visited only on Christmas and Father's Day. The last time he came, he brought expensive whiskey. Edward hadn't touched alcohol in over a decade. The only person who showed up unannounced, consistently and without obligation, was Anna, Daniel's wife. Anna was warm in a quiet, unassuming way. She worked at the local community center and had a knack for speaking to people as if they mattered. While Daniel immersed himself in corporate deals, Anna showed up with homemade soup and sat next to Edward with a book. "Do you remember this one?" she asked once, holding up The Old Man and the Sea. He smiled faintly and shook his head, playing the part. "No, I don't think I do." She read anyway. Every Tuesday afternoon became their ritual. She brought new titles, sometimes children's books, sometimes poetry. She didn't talk down to him. She didn't rush him. She didn't ask for anything. Edward noticed the subtle difference in how she treated him. She once found his bank statement in the kitchen by accident. Not a word was said. She returned it neatly to his desk and never asked about his finances. He once forgot to zip up his sweater properly, and she reached over gently, without embarrassment, to fix it. And yet, Edward also noticed something else. She watched him too. Once, she caught him glancing at a crossword puzzle with full comprehension in his eyes before he flipped it over. Their eyes met. She smiled. "Need help with 5 down?" she asked. He shrugged, and she didn't press. That moment lingered in his mind for days. 3 months into his stay, Susan began treating the guest house as an extension of her authority. She walked in without knocking, rearranged furniture, told the nurse to start keeping a log of behavior. Edward played along. Some days he spoke with clarity, other days he fumbled deliberately. He made sure to create just enough inconsistency to keep them guessing. The nurse, Amanda, a sharp woman in her late 30s, started expressing doubts. Mr. Hawthorne's symptoms don't fit the expected progression, she noted to Susan. But Susan dismissed it. You're not a neurologist, she snapped. He's getting worse. I know my father. It was around this time that Susan began encouraging legal paperwork. We should probably get your will updated, she told him casually while trimming his hedges. It's not about money, Dad. It's about security. You'd want everything to be in the right hands if, God forbid, anything happened. Edward smiled and nodded. That night, he made a note of it in his leather journal, one of the only things he kept locked in a drawer. By the second year, Daniel stopped calling altogether. When Anna showed up without him for Thanksgiving, Susan made a snide comment at dinner. Guess your husband's too busy to care for his father. Anna didn't respond. She helped Edward with his napkin, poured him water, and sat beside him. The only people who never changed were Anna and the gardener, Frank. Frank, an old friend of Edward from the university grounds, came once a week. They exchanged looks and a few words while Susan wasn't around. Still fooling them? Frank asked once, hiding a smile. Like a Shakespearean comedy, Edward whispered. By the end of year 3, Edward was tired. Not physically. His health was surprisingly stable, but emotionally. Pretending to be less than he was, day after day, wore on him. But the picture had become clear. His son had emotionally withdrawn. His daughter saw him as a burden wrapped in future money. His grandchildren barely visited. His nurse suspected something, but stayed professional. Only Anna had remained present, tender, and utterly uninterested in anything he could give her. He sat alone in the guest house one evening, flipping through his old journals. 3 years of notes, observations, patterns of behavior. He knew the time had come. His birthday was approaching. The family would gather, not to celebrate him, but to fulfill social expectations and to hover silently around his anticipated demise. He would let them come, and this time he would speak, not as the confused, fumbling old man they'd grown used to, but as Edward Hawthorne, the man who had once inspired hundreds of students to think for themselves, who had loved deeply, and who had one final lesson to teach. And he knew exactly who deserved to hear it. Edward Hawthorne settled into the rhythms of his new life with quiet precision. Each morning, he woke early, prepared a modest breakfast he didn't truly need help with, and sat by the window in the guest house that Susan proudly claimed was the perfect place for Dad. The window overlooked a patch of grass and a rose bush that Margaret had planted decades ago, now mostly overgrown, the blooms of fading memory of a life once filled with real family, not this polished performance of obligation. What the others didn't know, what they hadn't asked to know, was that Edward was documenting everything. His days had structure, 1 hour of visible confusion, 2 hours of reading behind closed doors, 20 minutes of subtle memory tests played out with those who visited, and long stretches of silence used not for resting, but for listening to the words people said when they thought he wasn't paying attention. The performance evolved carefully. Edward never exaggerated the act. He understood that real dementia was not dramatic, but quietly disorienting. So, some days, he pretended to forget the names of his grandchildren. Other days, he confused dates on the calendar, left the tap running, or accidentally poured orange juice into his coffee. Susan became increasingly irritated with these moments. She never scolded him outright, but the sighs, the short tone, the patronizing hand on his back, those told him more than words. Her visits, at first regular, began to thin out. I'm swamped with meetings, she explained, but I'll check on you later. Later became twice a week, then once. Daniel, meanwhile, stayed emotionally distant. He had always been the more stoic of the two children, but Edward recalled a time when Daniel's hugs had been tighter, his words warmer. That Daniel had long disappeared. Now, when he did visit, which by the second year was once every few months, it was always scheduled, brief and stiff. He brought gifts that looked expensive but meaningless. Noise-canceling headphones, digital calendars, gadgets Edward had no need for. Daniel seemed uncomfortable in the presence of slowness, of age. And more than that, he seemed deeply afraid of the man his father was becoming, or appeared to be. It wasn't grief or worry. It was inconvenience cloaked in thin politeness. Anna remained the exception. Every week, without fail, she brought fresh food, a different book, or sometimes nothing at all, just her company. She never looked bored. She never rushed. Her eyes always met his, and her voice never rose in volume, as if trying to make herself understood to a child. Instead, she spoke to him like a man, like someone still whole. One afternoon, she brought a small notebook. "Thought we could write a short story together," she said, smiling. "I'll write the first line, and you write the next." Edward, pretending to squint at the pen in confusion, took it slowly, then, without hesitation, penned a perfect second line. Anna said nothing, but her eyes flickered. That night, Edward added another note to his journal. "She knows. She doesn't ask. She lets me exist." The nurse, Amanda, was another source of quiet insight. Over time, Edward saw in her a gentle skepticism. She never directly confronted Susan, but her log entries became subtly coded. Client appears inconsistent in cognitive lapses. Memory retention unusually strong in select categories. Once, when Susan was late and Amanda stayed behind, she sat across from Edward and asked softly, "Do you ever feel like people are treating you like someone else?" He looked at her, weighed the moment, and gave a rehearsed blank stare. She sighed. "That's what I thought." She never mentioned it again. It wasn't long before Susan made her move. In the spring of his second year, she arrived unannounced, papers in hand. "It's just for protection, Dad," she said, placing a folder on the kitchen table. "Power of attorney. In case something happens. You wouldn't want strangers making decisions about your house, your finances." Edward stared at her, as if trying to process the words. Then he looked down at the documents, feigning hesitation. "Do I have to?" he asked slowly. Susan softened her voice. "No, but it would give all of us peace of mind." Edward signed, knowing he had a separate, legally valid revocation already filed with his lawyer, set to activate with a single phone call. He filed the copy she gave him into a drawer that looked messy, but was actually methodically organized by category. His real financial records were encrypted on a small USB drive, kept inside an old hardcover edition of Don Quixote. That spring, something shifted in the dynamic between Edward and Anna. She stopped bringing books and instead began asking questions. Subtle ones. "Do you miss teaching?" she asked one day, kneeling to fix the hem of a curtain. Edward nodded slowly. "Sometimes I forget I even taught." Anna smiled, clearly disbelieving him. "Funny, you still have perfect grammar when you speak." Another time, she noticed a stack of old essays on the bookshelf. "Did you grade these?" she asked. Edward looked surprised. "I don't remember." But Anna held up one paper, marked in precise red ink with nuanced commentary. "I think you do." He never admitted it, but the unspoken understanding between them became a comfort. Anna didn't break the illusion. She respected the performance, but quietly undermined the premise by treating him as capable. Edward began testing her too. Once he dropped a rare reference to a Kafka short story, half a quote, buried in a mumbled sentence. Anna picked it up instantly and finished the line. "You do remember," she whispered. Susan's involvement grew colder. She now used Edward's condition to justify rearranging his life. "You shouldn't be handling bills anymore," she said. "I've spoken to the bank. I'll take care of it from now on." Edward let her. She didn't know the account she accessed had limited funds. His primary estate was now protected by a trust overseen by an independent lawyer. Another detail Susan hadn't bothered to investigate. Edward kept a mental chart of how people responded to his condition. Visitors became less frequent. Former colleagues stopped calling. One day, a distant cousin stopped by while in town. She brought cookies and stayed for 15 minutes. On the way out, she patted his hand and said, "At least you won't remember how lonely you are." Edward didn't respond. He watched her leave and crossed her name off the back of his notebook. By the end of the second year, even the tone of the air around him had changed. Conversations were now held about him, not with him. Decisions were made for him, not with him. His world was being shaped by those who didn't ask what he wanted, but assumed they already knew. The irony, of course, was that in pretending to lose himself, he had become more observant than ever. The house was full of voices, yet hollow with neglect. Edward was the ghost of his own life, floating through rooms where people saw only a fading shadow, not the man within. And yet, Anna remained a constant. When she began arriving with paintbrushes and scrap wood, Edward watched curiously. "I thought you might like to help me make something," she said. "We can build a birdhouse. It'll give the cardinals a place when they return." He nodded. Together, over the course of 3 visits, they constructed a small wooden birdhouse. He guided her hands silently when she held the sarong. She didn't acknowledge it. When they finished, she placed it outside the window, and every morning Edward woke to see it perched there, a tiny monument to the fact that someone had still seen him. By this time, Daniel had grown increasingly distant from Anna. She didn't speak of it, but Edward noticed her eyes looked tired, her tone slightly heavier. Once, while making tea, she said without thinking, "I don't think your son likes who I've become." Edward tilted his head. "And who is that?" She smiled faintly. "Someone who sees more than she used to." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. There was a moment in early autumn when Edward nearly ended the act. Amanda, the nurse, had taken a phone call outside, and Susan was in the guest house sorting papers. Edward had reached for a pen and began to jot a list of quotes from memory, something he hadn't done since his university days. Susan came in suddenly and saw it. "What's this?" she asked, picking up the page. He quickly covered it with his hand. "Just scribbles," he muttered. She frowned, skeptical, but then she laughed nervously. "You're getting poetic in your confusion." "Huh?" And just like that, the moment passed. Edward let it go, but he knew now the end was approaching. 3 years had passed since he began. The boundaries of the test had solidified. The results were undeniable. The people who treated him as a burden had done so consistently. The one person who treated him with grace, curiosity, and humanity had asked for nothing and given everything. Soon, it would be time to reveal the truth. But not yet. Not until his birthday. Not until they were all in the same room, finally pretending they cared. Only then, Edward thought, would the final act begin, and it would not be performed in silence. Edward Hawthorne's 77th birthday arrived not with fanfare, but with calculated precision. For 3 years, he had meticulously orchestrated his life as a man slowly descending into the depths of cognitive decline. But today, this one day, was not going to be part of the act. It was going to be the final movement in a performance that had tested loyalty, exposed hypocrisy, and quietly rewarded genuine kindness. The family, largely unaware of the storm brewing beneath Edward's still, observant exterior, arrived with their masks on, prepared for another polite and somber gathering around the man they believed barely remembered their names. The plan had been Susan's idea. She insisted on hosting the small family party at her house, decorating the dining room with neutral, non-threatening pastels. "We don't want to overstimulate him," she explained to Anna over the phone a week prior. "Keep it calm, just family, soft food, quiet music. It's not a celebration. It's a gentle reminder he's still with us." Anna, who had heard such clinical phrasing from Susan countless times, didn't argue. She simply replied, "They'll bring a cake," and left it at that. Edward spent the morning in quiet contemplation. Seated at the kitchen table of the guest house, he no longer pretended to need. He sipped his tea, black and strong, without spilling a drop. On the table sat a small box wrapped in aged newspaper, the only gift he planned to give today. Inside was a set of revised legal documents, a handwritten letter, and a flash drive containing recordings he'd taken over the past 2 years with a hidden camera installed in his study lamp. It wasn't for revenge. It was for clarity, evidence of truth to accompany his words. By 2 p.m., the family had arrived. Susan greeted him first, air-kissing his cheek and fussing with his collar. "You look nice, Dad. I had Amanda iron your shirt yesterday. See? It fits you perfectly." She smiled like someone who had completed a chore. Her husband, Greg, followed, offering a distracted nod before turning his attention to the football game playing in the other room. Daniel arrived with one of his sons, 15-year-old Matthew, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Happy birthday, Dad," Daniel said without eye contact, then turned to take a call in the hallway. The other grandchildren handed Edward a sign card that Susan had clearly orchestrated. They called him Grandpa, Eddie, despite having never used that name before. Only Anna approached him like a person greeting an equal. She handed him a modest box, homemade biscotti, his favorite, and kissed him gently on the forehead. "Happy birthday, Edward," she whispered. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a quiet sense of expectation. She knew something was coming. He could see it in the way she lingered beside him longer than usual, in the way her hand brushed his shoulder twice before she pulled away. The afternoon unfolded like a theatrical scene. A quiet lunch, overcooked chicken and mashed carrots for his benefit, though Edward ate sparingly. Light conversation filled the space with hollow pleasantries. Daniel talked about quarterly reports. Susan bragged about her daughter's dance recital. No one asked Edward what he thought, what he remembered, or what he felt. He sat in silence, observing them through a lens of detachment. It wasn't until Susan brought out the cake, a dry sponge topped with "Happy 77th birthday, Dad," and shaky icing, that the atmosphere began to shift. The candles were not lit. "Better safe than sorry," Susan explained with a patronizing grin. "Wouldn't want you to burn your eyebrows, Dad." Edward placed his hands on the arms of the chair and stood, steadily, without a tremble. The room paused. He cleared his throat, took one look around at the faces that assumed he was moments away from another babble about the weather or misnaming his son, and then he spoke, his voice rich, unwavering, and articulate. "Before anyone cuts the cake, I'd like to say a few words." Silence fell like a stone. Susan blinked. Greg glanced up from his phone. Daniel straightened slightly in his chair. Anna didn't move. "For the past 3 years," Edward began, "I have lived as a man you believed was losing his mind. Some of you grieved quietly. Some made plans. Some withdrew. Others took charge. I observed all of it." Susan frowned. "Dad, maybe you should sit." "No," Edward said, firmly but without raising his voice. "I'll stand. I've stood longer for lesser causes. You see, I've never had dementia. Not for a single day. Everything you saw, the forgetfulness, the repetition, the confusion, was a choice. My choice." The words cut through the room like a blade. Daniel rose halfway from his seat, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking," Edward continued, "about truth. About testing love without reward. About seeing who shows up when they think you have nothing left to give. You all passed through this house like actors reading from a script you barely understood. You assumed I was fading and adjusted your priorities accordingly. And now here we are." Susan's face had gone pale. "She probably put you up to this." Edward looked at her, the sadness in his eyes palpable. "That's the most tragic part, Susan. You think kindness is manipulation. You've been so consumed with control that you can't even see when love walks in the room." He turned to Daniel. "And you? This is absurd. Dad, this is a serious accusation. You lied to us? For years?" Edward tilted his head. "And what would you have done if I told the truth? That I was fine, but suspicious of your intentions?" She gave me space to be whoever I needed to be. Not out of pity, but out of respect. She's the only one in this room who treated me like a human being, without an agenda, without entitlement, and without needing anything in return. He pulled the wrapped box from beside his chair and handed it to her. "This is for you. Inside, you'll find documents that concern my estate, my trust, and a personal letter. You are the executor of my final wishes. That I wanted to see what mattered more to you, me, or what I represented in your inheritance plans." He paused. "Would you have treated me differently?" No one spoke. Greg had vanished from the conversation, pretending to be absorbed in his phone. Susan looked horrified, not out of guilt but embarrassment. Daniel was fuming. "So you put us through emotional hell to prove a point?" "No," Edward replied calmly. "You put yourselves through emotional hell by failing to ask the right questions. By forgetting that I'm not a title, or a trust fund, or an estate to manage. I'm your father. I'm a man. And I was alone." He turned to Anna, but not entirely alone. She met his eyes, the hint of moisture gathering at the corners. He nodded. Anna knew, or suspected, but she never asked for confirmation. The room erupted. Are you kidding me? Susan snapped, standing now, her face red. You're leaving everything to her? No, Edward corrected. Not everything. But what matters most, yes. Because she earned it, not by blood, but by action. You all had the same opportunity. Daniel scoffed. She manipulated you. You're old and lonely, and she saw an opening. No, Edward interrupted sharply, his voice suddenly thunderous. Do not project your own motives onto others. She was there when no one else was. She helped me build a birdhouse while you helped yourselves to assumptions. She read to me when you sent automated birthday cards. She asked questions while you drafted your wills in your heads. Susan burst into tears, not for heartbreak, but rage. This is outrageous. You need a psychiatric evaluation. This is elder abuse. I was never angry with you for being distant, but I hoped you would at least speak to me like a person before treating me like a dying asset. I'm sorry that you're losing something, but you already lost what mattered. With that, Edward sat down again. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of exposure, resentment, and the consequences of neglect. Anna clutched the box, unsure if she should speak. But Edward simply smiled at her and said, Thank you for seeing me. That night, after the family dispersed, some fuming, some stunned into silence, Edward returned to his guest house with Anna walking beside him. For the first time in years, he moved freely without feigned frailty. Amanda, who had remained silent during the entire ordeal, was waiting at the door. You were right, she said softly, her voice filled with restrained awe. They showed you who they were. Edward nodded. And now, they know who I am. Inside the box, Anna would later find the trust documents legally naming her as the beneficiary of the house and the bulk of Edward's assets. But more importantly, she would find the letter. Dear Anna, when this act began, I never expected to find a friend. I simply wanted truth. What I discovered was something more valuable than wealth. Grace in its purest form. Thank you for honoring me while the rest rehearse their grief. Whatever you do with what I leave behind, know that I leave in the hands of someone who still believes in people. That is rare, and that is everything. With deepest gratitude, Edward Hawthorne. The next day, the phone call started. Susan threatened legal action. Daniel sent a lawyer's letter. Edward ignored them all. His performance was over. The curtain had fallen, and what remained was not bitterness, but peace. The fallout from Edward Hawthorne's revelation arrived not as a single explosion, but as a series of waves, each one louder, uglier, and more desperate than the last. Within 24 hours of his 77th birthday, the carefully crafted facades of his children began to crumble. What had once been polite distance now erupted into calls, emails, and legal threats, their tones ranging from performative concern to open hostility. But Edward, seated once again at his kitchen table in the guest house that was never truly his prison, remained unmoved. The test was over. The answers were in. There was nothing left to debate. Susan called first. At 8:17 the next morning, her number appeared on his landline caller ID. He let it ring. She left a voicemail, her voice trembling but controlled, like a performer trying to hold a mask in place while the edges cracked. Dad, please. I don't know what's going on with you. Maybe you're confused. Maybe someone is putting these ideas in your head. I've always tried to do what's best for you. You have to know that. This thing with Anna, it's not right. We're family. She's not. Just call me back. Please. Edward didn't respond. He sat with the receiver still in his hand, replaying her words silently. She's not family. The words echoed longer than Susan likely intended. Not because they were cruel, but because they were revealing. After all the years, after all the efforts he had made to instill values of empathy and grace in his children, Susan still saw love as something transactional, something inherited, something deserved by default. He carefully placed the phone down and returned to his book, a worn copy of Camus' The Fall, one of his favorites, with the corners folded and margins filled with notes from decades past. The next call came from Daniel's lawyer 2 days later. A curt voicemail informed him that the distribution of Edward's assets raised questions and that Daniel had concerns about undue influence. Edward smiled at the phrasing. Concerns. Not grief. Not betrayal. Concerns. As if his estate were a broken pipe or a glitch in an investment account. The lawyer's tone betrayed everything. Daniel hadn't been wounded. He had been embarrassed. Outmaneuvered. Later that evening, Edward invited Amanda, the nurse, to sit with him on the porch. The autumn air had begun to turn, and the scent of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke carried memories of earlier, simpler years. He poured them both tea, peppermint, Amanda's favorite, and handed her a brown envelope. This, he said gently, is for you. Amanda hesitated, then took it and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter of recommendation, written in Edward's elegant cursive, accompanied by a certified statement addressed to the state nursing board. It praised her discretion, her integrity, and her quiet dignity in handling what had been a very unusual patient. I know you suspected, Edward said. You didn't call me out. You didn't play along. You respected my silence and observed with professionalism. I appreciated that more than you know. Amanda smiled softly, her eyes glistening. You reminded me why I became a nurse. Most days I feel like I'm just managing symptoms. But with you, I felt like I was watching a soul reclaim itself. They drank their tea in silence after that. Across town, Susan and Daniel met in a cafe to strategize. Their conversation was curt, tense, and defensive. Susan was furious, not just about the inheritance, but about the humiliation. He made fools of us, she hissed. He tricked us for years, and now he's giving everything to her? Daniel, ever more detached, sipped his espresso and scrolled through his phone. We can fight it. Anna isn't blood. Dad's old. It's easy to argue diminished capacity. Susan gripped her cup tighter. But what if he's not? What if he's really fine? Then we have nothing. Daniel looked at her flatly. Then we move on. The words hung between them. For all her desperation, Susan saw what Daniel had already accepted. Edward's choice wasn't just about money. It was a condemnation of their entire way of relating to him. And deep down, they both knew they had failed the test, not because they hadn't loved their father, but because they had taken his presence for granted. They assumed he was old, pliable, finished. That was their mistake, and it had cost them more than an inheritance. Meanwhile, Anna sat in her own home, the box Edward had given her still unopened on the kitchen table. She hadn't had the strength to look inside just yet. It felt like more than a gift. It felt like a weight, a responsibility. She had never wanted anything from him but connection. Now he had placed a future in her hands. When she finally did open it, she found everything he had promised: legal documents, passwords, bank account instructions, keys to safety deposit boxes. But there was more. In the bottom of the box, beneath the formalities, was a worn leather-bound journal. It was Edward's. The first entry was dated the day after he moved into Susan's guest house. Every page thereafter documented his observations, his thoughts, his hopes, and most importantly, his heartbreak. Anna read every word. She read about how Susan had asked him to sign papers without looking him in the eye. She read about how Daniel had brought gifts that made him feel like a prop in a corporate PR stunt. She read about Amanda's kindness, about Frank the gardener's quiet humor, about his memories of Margaret. She read about the days he nearly gave up the act, how he longed for someone to truly see him again. And then she read the entry about her. October 22nd. She brought apple pie today. Didn't ask if I remembered it was my favorite. Just placed it on the table and told me about her morning. No questions. No pity. Just warmth. I felt alive again. Anna cried. Not because she had gained anything, but because someone had seen the truth in her long before she ever realized the weight of her presence. Edward had been more than a patient. He had been a witness to her own quiet despair, her own loneliness in a marriage that had become more like a business partnership. His recognition of her, his trust, felt like a validation of everything she thought had been invisible. Weeks passed. Susan tried to file a motion in probate court to contest the will. It was dismissed. Edward's legal paperwork was airtight, his medical evaluations recent and clear. The judge, upon reviewing the details, remarked that this man knew exactly what he was doing. Daniel never called again. His marriage to Anna dissolved quietly, without fanfare or public conflict. It was Anna who filed the papers, citing irreconcilable differences. Daniel didn't contest them. When asked by friends and colleagues why she left, she gave a simple answer: because someone showed me what respect really looks like. Edward eventually chose to move out of Susan's guest house, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He purchased a small, elegant cottage near the river with the help of Anna. There, he lived on his own terms. Amanda visited weekly. Frank brought him fresh vegetables from his garden. And Anna, though no longer bound to him by marriage, remained his closest confidant. They met every Thursday for lunch, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. One crisp winter afternoon, Edward passed away quietly in his sleep, a copy of Leaves of Grass resting on his chest. It was Anna who found him the next morning, his hands still resting on the page he had folded the week before. His funeral was modest by design. He had requested no grand eulogies, no hollow speeches. Instead, he left a single note to be read aloud at the ceremony, which Anna delivered with calm resolve. It read, "I was not testing loyalty. I was seeking truth. In the end, it wasn't the money or the name or the title that mattered. It was the moments of genuine care, of quiet presence, of eyes that met mine without expectation. I leave this world as a man seen. And that, more than anything, is the legacy I hope to build." After the funeral, Susan and Daniel left in silence. They received a modest sum from the trust, just enough to leave no room for complaint, but not enough to satisfy the hunger they had allowed to define their relationship with their father. Anna inherited the cottage, the journal, and a foundation that Edward had quietly established in Margaret's name, the Hawthorne Fund for Compassionate Elder Care. It was to be managed by Anna and Amanda together. Years later, Anna would be seen walking through the garden Edward had started, pruning the rosebush that Margaret once planted. She would smile when the cardinals landed on the small birdhouse they had built together, proof that love, when freely given, outlasts even the deepest betrayal. And in her heart, she would carry the quiet truth of Edward Hawthorne's final years, not as a tale of deception, but as a victory of dignity over pretense, of clarity over performance, and of kindness over inheritance.